I wanted to speak to this bill and appreciate the co-sponsors. I think Councilmember Navarro is also a co-sponsor. I've worked with her on this bill on components. It is also going to be known as the COVID-19 Renter Relief Act. And the goal here is to prohibit rent increases on residential property. There was some back and forth. Obviously, we're in an emergency. I had considered adding commercial property to the bill, but to just keep it simple and to focus on the core of the issue that I've been presented with and that I've seen, we're going to focus on residential. And so this would prohibit the increase of residential rents during this crisis and for immediately after, as people are recovering. The conversation we just had about how we're going to need to recover. 1 in 10 Americans out of work right now. A third of our residents are renters. Many less protections and money for people who are renting. There have been some protections for homeowners who have mortgages. We need federal action to help people who are just trying to pay their current rent, let alone any increase during this time as they're trying to deal. We also know our renting population tends to be our lower income population. Also, the folks who are most at risk being in close quarters, it's very difficult to social distance. So there's a lot of anxiety going on in our particularly our multifamily renting population. And many are struggling. Our office has received some, unfortunately, reports and communications from residents that they have seen increases in some cases, pretty large increases. I want to mention just a few because this has been a point of contention already. And we will be releasing this information later with permission from some of the residents. DHCA actually has been trying to negotiate with the gallery in Bethesda, where they've seen an increase of 35% with at least one resident. Quebec Terrace, where I grew up in Long Branch, we've seen just in March an increase of 9% and also additional late fees added to residents. At the Grand, maybe this is one of the worst ones that I was directly reached out to, the Grand in North Bethesda in the White Flint area. A resident wrote in about didn't know what they could do and asking for help about an increase of 35% from $1,600 to over $2,200 a month. And they didn't know how they were going to deal with that. There were several other incidences at the Grand itself. I've seen at least 3 others at the Grand, ranging from 14% to 60% increases. And these were decisions that had to be made in March about increases that were going to take place by July. ABC 7 reported last week about the Galaxy Apartments in Silver Spring and a resident who was facing an increase right now and didn't know how she was going to pay it. These are just some of the examples. DHCA, when I asked how many calls are they getting, they're saying they're hearing about this problem every day. That was the quote. The Renters Alliance also works with renters, has said they've heard of multiple issues and this is a problem. At the same time, I've also been in touch with some of our landlords and property managers, many of whom are doing the right thing. And doing their best to work with their residents to ensure that they can get help, to work with them to modify payments, to halt rent increases. And I want to commend, many of them. I know Southern Management is doing this. I know I just spoke to Richard Cohen at Wilco Companies yesterday on the commercial side and the residential side. They're doing this, and there's others. AOBA has worked with their folks to make sure that they're doing this, and I think I commend that activity, and I think it's the right thing. The problem is that as I've cited, there's people who aren't doing it, and it's not just at one property or so. There's multiple, and this bill would simply say that during this crisis, this COVID-19 crisis, that there cannot be rent increases that would occur during the crisis or 30 days after. The bill would then sunset 120 days after the crisis in the state of emergency ends. And that's because landlords are currently required to give 90 days notice on rent increases. So that's incorporating that time period. I think if you asked anybody, is that the right thing to do? They would say it is. And we want to encourage everyone to halt these increases because people are having trouble paying their normal rent. As I said, 1 in 10 Americans out of work. Last two things I'll say is that DHCA, or Department of Housing and Community Affairs, considers an increase of 10% to be excessive in constructive eviction, meaning that's unable to play, and they try to negotiate. But currently, if a complaint is given in those grounds, all they can do is try to negotiate on behalf of the tenant. There's no requirement that the rent has to be reduced. So we need to, now more than ever, protect our vulnerable populations as we advocate at the federal and the state level for help for landlords and owners of buildings so that they can pay their bills and pay their employees, but for renters especially, who are very vulnerable right now, and many of whom need assistance. So I hope that my colleagues will support this bill. It's not a rent freeze. It's not rent control. It is a temporary measure to help people who are struggling right now during this crisis. So I thank you for the time, and we'll be talking more about it, I'm sure, over the next week.